Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
Today we will be doing the second chapter of biology, that is control and coordination. Control and coordination is another very important life process for a living organism. It controls all the activities going on in a living organism. Now, what is control? Control is a power to restrain or regulate. It means that all the some activities inside a living organism, they have to sometimes be slowed down or stopped or sometimes started. So all these control is done by this system, that is control and coordination system. For example, when you are sleeping, your breathing rate, your heart rate slows down. But when you are doing a vigorous exercise, your breathing rate, your heart rate increases. This control is maintained by this system. The second word is coordination. It is the harmonious working of interrelated parts of the body. All the interrelated parts, although they are different, but they have to work in coordination with each other for a smooth functioning. I will give you an example. Suppose you are hungry and you see a food item in front of you. So what happens? The salivary glands start secreting saliva. Your hand moves to pick up the food item and ingest it. The teeth help in chewing the food. The tongue helps in swallowing it. Esophagus pushes it further. The stomach starts churning. Liver starts secreting the bile. So, and likewise. So all these parts of the body, they have to work in coordination with each other, which is very important for smooth functioning of a system and for smooth functioning of the whole organism. It plays a very important role in a life process. Now, there are two modes of control and coordination. One is nervous and another is chemical. In plants, nervous system is not present. They have only chemical control and coordination. While in animals, both nervous and chemical control is present. Together, it is known as neuroendocrine system. So we'll study about all this in detail under this chapter. Now, first, let us start with the human nervous system. The human nervous system consists of three main parts: the brain, the spinal cord, and all the associated nerves. These parts, the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves, what do? They control and coordinate the activities of the body with the help of the impulse generated in response to a stimuli. So, first let us understand the key words used here. What is a stimulus? The plural is stimuli. It is an agent, a factor, a chemical, or internal and external environment. Anything which is outside our body or inside our body which triggers a response is called a stimulus. For example, you are looking at the food, so the sight is a stimulus for us. The response is the reaction of the body which it produces in response to this stimulus. The reaction of the body is called response. There are certain specialized tips of the nerve cells which are called receptors. They receive the stimulus from internal or external environment. I will give you an example. There is a cat and the cat looks at a mouse. Now, the sight of the mouse is a stimulus. What happens then? The cat starts running and chasing the mouse. Here, the stimulus is the sight of the mouse, and the reaction or the response is the running of the cat towards it to get the food. So, this is how the stimulus and the response work. And these responses, they are controlled by our nervous system, which consists of brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Some examples of receptors are gustatory receptors, which are present in the tongue. They help us to taste the food or anything else. Olfactory receptors are present in the nose. They help us to detect the smells. The photoreceptors present in the eye, they are sensitive to light and they help us to form the image in the brain. So these are the examples of certain receptors. This is in a nutshell what is the human nervous system. Now, the main functional and structural unit of a nervous system is a nerve cell. The nerve cell is also called a neuron. let us study in detail about the structure of a neuron. This is the structure of a nerve cell or a neuron. The structure of nerve cell neuron, we can divide it into three parts. First is the dendrites, the small, tiny, thin projections coming out of the cell body. The second is the cell body, which is the rounded broad structure with a prominent nucleus, dense cytoplasm and many cell organelles. Then there is a long thin projection, cytoplasmic projection, which is called axon. The axon is sometimes covered with a sheath which is called the myelin sheath. So the three main parts are the dendrites, the cell body and the axon. The axon ends up into small branches. These branches are called nerve endings. The nerve endings then they release certain chemicals which are called neurotransmitters. So what happens whenever there is a stimulus, the dendrites they start a electric impulse. They generate this impulse in these endings of the dendrites. Then this impulse is passed on to the cell body and then to the axon. It travels in one direction from the dendrites to the axon. As this impulse reaches the nerve ending, it releases the chemicals, that is neurotransmitters. It releases the neurotransmitters either on the organ or the muscle cell or to another neuron wherever the action is required. So the bundles of nerve cells makes one nerve. Now what happens whenever there are two neurons associated with one action, there is a gap in between two neurons. There is a gap between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another neuron. This gap is called the synapse. It is the junction where one neuron ends and the other neuron starts. The axons are not in physical contact with the dendrite. There is a gap. So this gap is known as synapse. So whenever there is a stimulus, the nerve generates impulse, the impulse travels, the nerve endings, the axon releases neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters again generate an impulse in these dendrites of second neuron. This then impulse again travels down the neuron and the axon of second neuron releases the neurotransmitters. The nerve endings, it either ends on an organ or a muscle cell, right? So wherever action is required. When it ends on a muscle cell, it releases the neurotransmitter on the surface of the muscle cell. The muscle cells have certain receptors which are sensitive to these neurotransmitters. Whenever the neurotransmitters are released, the myofibrils present in the muscle cell, they slide, which shortens the muscle cell. So as the muscle cell shortens, what happens? The muscles are attached to the bones, so it causes the movement of the bone. This is how the nerve cell produces action, the structure of the neuron and how it acts. Now let us move on to the next topic. Okay, now in continuation with our chapter Control and Coordination, let us move on. Now there are three types of nervous actions, the actions showed by the nerves: voluntary actions, involuntary actions and reflex actions. The voluntary actions are the conscious activities or the actions which you take at your own will. For example, if you pick up a pen and start writing, now this is a voluntary action. For example, writing, walking, all these are voluntary actions. The involuntary actions, you cannot control them. They do not act according to your will. The involuntary actions are usually seen in internal organs. For example, the heart is beating. You cannot control that. The ribs cage are moving to facilitate breathing, inhalation and exhalation. You cannot control that. All such actions are called involuntary actions. Both voluntary and involuntary actions are controlled by the nerves. Yet there another type of action which are shown by the nerves, they are reflex actions. Now the reflex actions are automatic, mechanical, immediate response to a harmful stimuli. They are spontaneous responses. There is no thinking process involved in such actions. Now I'll give you an example. If you touch a hot plate, some hot surface, you immediately just remove your hand without thinking about it, without the brain perceiving the pain. You just remove it. That is a reflex action. For example, you are crossing a road, you see a heavy, fast moving vehicle coming towards you. You immediately move backward. That is a reflex action in which the thinking process is not involved. You quickly respond for protection, for your survival. Now, let us study in detail about the reflex action. The reflex arc. Reflex arc is a path followed by the stimulus from the receptor organ back to the effector organ. This path is known as the reflex arc. The parts of the reflex arc are the stimulus, the receptor organ which receives the stimulus, the sensory nerve which carries the stimulus from the receptor organ to the central nervous system. Next is the central nervous system, either brain or spinal cord. Inside the central nervous system, there are relay neurons which connect the sensory nerve to the motor nerve. The motor nerve carries the impulse from the central nervous system to the effector organ, where actually the action is shown, the response is shown. This continuous path is known as reflex arc. What happens? In this case, I have shown a hot cup. So if you touch a hot surface, what happens? This touch is a stimulus. The receptor organs are stimulated. They receive the stimulus. Then there are dendrites of the sensory nerve. These dendrites generate an impulse. This impulse is passed on through the sensory nerve into the central nervous system. This is the sensory nerve, the receptor organ. Now in this case, I have shown a spinal cord. Some reflex arc, actually most of the reflex arcs are completed in the spinal cord, but there are few in the neck region, head region. For example, movement of eyes, they are controlled by the brain. Otherwise, all other reflex arcs are completed in the spinal cord. Now, once the sensory organ reaches the spinal cord, there is a relay neuron. This relay neuron receives the impulse from the sensory nerve and passes on to the motor nerve. The motor nerve then carries the impulse towards the effector organ. In this case, it is the muscle of the hand. Now, as the neurotransmitters are released on the muscles contract and you immediately move your hand. So, this is how the impulse travels without actually the involvement of thinking process or the brain or the intelligence. Alright, so this is how the reflex arc, the reflex action works. However, there is a role of brain in it. Whenever a reflex arc is completed, a reflex action is taken, it goes into the brain for the memory. If a child touches a hot surface and the reflex action is completed, it goes into the memory. Next time the child will not make the same mistake again. So it is stored in the brain. So there is a role of thinking, but not during this reflex action. Alright? So why do we need reflex action? You know, in the central nervous system, there are many centers. They receive information from all parts of the body. Then the information is processed depending upon whatever is stored in the brain, the information. The thinking goes on, and then accordingly the response is produced. What should be the response to this? But what happens? This whole process takes a little bit of time. Sometimes the stimulus is very harmful. If this delay on thinking process, it might lead to some harmful effect. In this case, if you do not remove your hand immediately, spontaneously, you might burn your hand. So, to avoid such harmful effects, to avoid such harmful incidents, what happens? Our brain needs the reflex actions. A quick response is required. Delay can be harmful. In such cases, reflex actions play a very important role in our survival and in our protection. Let us compare two actions, reflex action with a voluntary action like walking or talking, right? Now, first of all, reflex actions are automatic. You cannot control them. On the other hand, walking is a voluntary action. You do it at your own will. The reflex actions, the main function is survival and protection. Walking and such other voluntary activities have many functions, but other than survival and protection. Survival and protection are not the main functions of voluntary actions. The reflex sections are inborn, while walking and other voluntary actions, they are acquired through learning. You learn them during your lifetime. So this is the comparison between reflex action and other voluntary actions. I hope clear with this reflex section. Now let us go to the next topic, that is the human nervous system, the classification, how do we divide it. The human nervous system can be divided broadly into two parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of brain and spinal cord. Brain is present in the skull and inside the skull, and spinal cord is a tubular structure which extends from the neck to the lumbar region on the back side. The peripheral nervous system consists of all the nerves arising from the brain and the spinal cord. They can again be divided into two types, the voluntary peripheral nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The voluntary peripheral nervous system controls all the voluntary actions. It is again consists of two types of nerves, cranial nerves and spinal nerves. The cranial nerves are those nerves which are arising from the brain, while the spinal nerves are arising from the spinal cord throughout the body, and they go to all the organs of the body. The autonomic nervous system is again of two types, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Together, parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system control all the involuntary actions of the internal organs, like beating of heart, working of digestive system, working of kidney. All these are controlled by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Now, let us summarize what are the functions of nervous system. First is control. They control and regulate all the activities of the body, whether voluntary or involuntary. Second is coordination. Different but interrelated organs, they work harmoniously in coordination with each other for smooth functioning of a system, like digestive system. So different parts of digestive system have to work harmoniously with each other for smooth functioning, for efficiency. Thirdly, the involuntary movement of internal organs. These are also controlled by the nervous system, like beating of heart, movement of rib cage for breathing. All these involuntary actions are controlled by nervous system. Next, reflex action, which we just studied in detail. So the quick response to harmful stimuli are regulated by nervous system. And lastly, intelligence, memory, thinking, all these are also controlled by our nervous system. Now let us move on to the next topic. Now let us move on to the next topic, that is human brain, the most amazing organ of our body. The human brain is the main coordinating center for all the activities which are going on in our body, whether voluntary or involuntary. All the activities are controlled by brain. It has neurons. All the neurons are concentrated here. Millions of neurons are present which control different activities. The brain receives information from all parts of the activity and guides them what to do, how to do. Alright? So, the parts of the brain. Brain has basically mainly three parts, the forebrain, midbrain and hindbrain. The forebrain, which is present in the front and the upward side, the main part is the cerebrum. Cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It is a part of the forebrain. This is all cerebrum. It has inward folds in it. Then the second part is the midbrain. It is present in the middle, in the center of the brain. Then this portion is the pons. This is medulla, and this is cerebellum. The cerebellum is present under the cerebrum on the back side. These three parts are the parts of actually the hindbrain. The medulla then continues and joins the spinal cord. Spinal cord is a tubular structure which extends from the neck, backside till the lumbar region. So this brain and spinal cord together, they form the central nervous system. The central nervous system, or the brain and the spinal cord, they are very delicate organs. They have to be protected. The protection is done in two ways. First, they are covered in the bony cage. The brain is covered by the cranium part of the skull, and the spinal cord is covered in the vertebral column, which extends from neck to the lumbar region. There are vertebral columns inside which the spinal cord is present. So the brain and spinal cord are protected by the bone covering. Apart from this, between the bone and the central nervous system, there is a layer which is known as meninges. This layer, between the layers of meninges, there is a fluid called CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. This cerebrospinal fluid protects the brain and spinal cord from the shock. It contains nutrients, it contains oxygen, it prevents the entry of germs or pathogens into the central nervous system. So brain is protected by with the bone cage as well as by this cerebrospinal fluid. Now let us study about the functions of each part. What role do they play? The cerebrum, as I told you, it is the largest part of the brain. Now it controls the thinking, intelligence, memory. It also has centers for speech, sight, smell, taste, all the sense organs. They send the information to the cerebrum. So whatever you are thinking, intelligence, memory, all these centers are present in the cerebrum. Next, the midbrain. Here, midbrain completes the reflex actions, reflex movements of head, neck and eyes. As we just studied in the last section, the reflex arcs, most of the reflex arc are completed in the spinal cord, but the reflex arcs of head region are completed in this part of the brain, that is the midbrain. For example, if you see a sharp thing coming towards your eye, you just completely close your eyes or move your head. This reflex action is completed in the midbrain. Next is the pons. Pons basically joins the cerebrum, cerebellum, midbrain and the medulla. So it acts as a relay center for all these parts of the brain. The medulla. Medulla has centers which control the involuntary actions of our body. For example, it has respiratory center that will control the breathing rate. It has cardiac center which controls the blood pressure and the heart rate. It also controls the involuntary action of alimentary canal like salivation, vomiting. So all such involuntary actions are controlled by medulla. Last, the cerebellum, this part. The cerebellum maintains the equilibrium, balance or posture while doing activities like walking, dancing, running or even riding a bicycle. Your posture, your balance, you don't fall down, okay? So your posture, your balance is maintained by cerebellum. So the different parts play different roles in the brain. Let us summarize the functions of the brain once again. First is, it receives information, sensory information from all the sense organs. It processes that information, stores it in the memory and also produces the response, the desired response for the body. Second function is control and coordination. It controls and coordinates the activities of all different and interrelated organs of our body. Thirdly, reflex actions. As we just studied, the midbrain also completes the reflex arc of the head region, like the closing of the eyes, movement of the neck, they are controlled by the brain. Lastly, it is also the center for intelligence, memory, reasoning, thinking. Brain plays a very important role. So with this, we complete the central nervous system and the study about the nervous system in humans. So now, let us discuss about very important part of central nervous system, that is spinal cord. Spinal cord is narrow cylindrical part of the central nervous system. It arises from the base of the brain till the lower lumbar region. Then it lies inside the vertebral column. On the back you will notice a hard thing in the middle, that is the vertebral column. Vertebral column is made up of small bones joined together. Each bone is called a vertebrate, right? So in between the vertebrates there are spaces. So the spinal cord gives off 31 pairs of nerves from this intervertebral spaces. So from the spinal cords, nerves are coming out, right? So these nerves are called spinal nerves. Okay. So, what are the function of two main functions of the spinal cord? Firstly, it is the center for many reflex actions. As I just told you under the topic of reflex arcs, many reflex actions are completed by the spinal cord. So, this lowers down the load of the brain. Second important function is it conducts sensory as well as motor impulses to the brain and from the brain. So, from the sensory organs, the impulse is carried out to the spinal cord and then to the brain, and from the brain to spinal cord back to the motor muscles. So, this helps in giving the messages to the brain and getting the message from the brain. So, these are the two main important functions of the spinal cord.